in there to cut it and make it you sort of drinkable. Or maybe it's just freshening it up and making it taste like apple again.
Yeah.
Yeah, because that ultimately is kind of the direction you're going in with it to add that sugar back. You spend all this time fermenting all the sugar out, and the first thing you do is, I need some more sugar back here.
Yeah. Well, and the problem is that a lot of people don't. It's difficult for them to determine how much sugar to add back. So we probably, we're talking about all of this back sweetening with fruit or honey or whatever. And I know there's people out there going, yeah, okay, I totally get that. And there's people out there going, yes, but how much? And the easy answer to that is pretty much as sweet as you need it to be for you.
You have to do it to taste. Every time I've ever, I'm a lazy winemaker, I really am, and I don't back sweeten very often, but every now and then I've found a batch that I absolutely need to. And the way I do it is the way they recommend on Got Mead is, take a glass and just keep adding a little drip at a time of honey until it tastes right, and then measure the specific gravity, and then do your batch to a little bit less than that.
So the moral of the story here is don't do it to the whole batch.
No, definitely not.
Unless of course you do it the way I do it, you just throw it in the freezer at 10:15 and wait for it to stop.
Well, I'm about to wave the Got Mead flag. You got to use the Got calculator. Come on.
Yeah.
Come on, everybody.
Oh, and it's fixing to undergo a huge overhaul. Just saying, it's coming soon.
So I do have a little trick with how I've adopted the Got Mead calculator, and I'm actually trying to find. So what I went and found was, so if anyone's familiar with the International Riesling Foundation and their scale that you'll often see on the back of Riesling bottles, I know the Finger Lakes in the U.S. is a region that commonly puts the scale on there. They have some information that classifies sweet, medium dry, medium sweet based on the acid to sugar ratio and the pH. So here's what I've kind of arrived at is when I know the pH of the thing that I want to sweeten, I have a sense of where that sweetness should be in relationship to the pH. So then I use the Got Mead calculator, the current gravity, to figure out how do I add enough sugar to get to the gravity that I think I want to be based on where the pH is, and then I add it in increments up to that point or past it if and then to taste to kind of work that out. And sometimes my initial thoughts on the ratio between the sugar and the acid are right. Sometimes they weren't, just because the acid is maybe a little more complex or less complex than the pH would indicate. But you kind of get to a point where you're not just back sweetening, you're trying to reach a more complex result, and that's where I think the acidity in it, if you don't have the sense of a pH of it, or you don't have a really good tuned in palate to the acidity of something versus the where the sugar will be balanced, you need to know the pH. I mean, I have a pH meter. I know some people don't, but I would recommend.
Though.
They're not, and I would recommend for people that are looking to get this balance right is consider other beverages that that have a good balance. I mean, be a nerd. If you have a bottle of Riesling that you really like and you like the balance of it, pour a sample, run it through the hydrometer, take a pH test on it, and then you've got right there. You say, okay, there's a rule of thumb. Your beverage might not be as complex, or it might be more complex than that bottle of Riesling. But there's a rule of thumb. Like if you like the way that tasted, now you know how much residual sugar is in it and what the pH is, and you can work to get into that range with whatever you're working on, because you have a presumption that it should be similarly pleasant. So that's kind of where I've gone with it, and I don't always, like I said, I don't always nail it, and sometimes I just, I quickly look at the pH, I look at the gravity at it, I go run it through the calculator and say, oh, that's, 1.25 pounds of honey, or that's 6 ounces of agave syrup, and I just throw it in there and mix it up, and I'm like, yeah, that tastes great. But that's 15 years of working at it.
Yeah.
You're not going to necessarily nail that up front, but mimic something that you do like, or, again, try to...
That's really good advice. I like that.
To work it out, to put in 1/4 of the sugar, then put in another quarter of the sugar, mix it up. And as soon as it tastes right, like you said, then you know you're all set. But keep track of that. Like, what was the gravity when you started? What was the gravity afterwards? How much sugar did that take? Make sure you have that somewhere, because the next time you want to do that, there's your guideline. You're starting to develop a profile for yourself that tasted right.
Yeah. And then,
definitely. Notes are critical.
Notes are so critical. A little sidebar there. I saw several people in the Got Mead group this week that were like, well, I didn't measure it, and so now I need to fix it. And it's like, well, without measurements, it's going to be kind of hard, And people, I was a seat-of-the-pants mead maker for many years until Pete beat me half to death over it. And, basically, I was always taking good notes, but I didn't take as good of notes as I could have. And this was many, many years ago. And once I, started doing that, I became like the biggest. That would be the first question. People would go, they'd email me and go, "So, Got Mead, what do I do with blah?" And I'd be going, "Send me your notes. You did take notes, right?"
Yeah.
Yeah,
I like to think that I've always taken notes, but I think it's because you and Pete may have browbeaten me before I even started.
Yeah, I was going to say,
I'm not certain,
unless you've been making mead more than about 17 years, you probably had to listen to me bitch about it,
Not necessarily. Some of us came from a scientific background too. Like I really should have been a lab monkey.
You still had to listen to me bitch about it. You were already doing it, but you still had to listen to me bitch about it.
Yeah,
right.
but and I bitched at other people about it too, because I was at the point where I could solve people's problems if they had their notes, but they didn't have their notes.
But they didn't have their
notes.
Like,
why didn't you write this down? You cannot expect to remember anything ever. Just don't. Assume you will forget it all. Write it all down.
And that's an interesting thing. I mean, I see a lot of the same posts and questions that you guys see too, and it is amusing to me sometimes where people don't really understand the question they're asking in the absence of information, and what that's going to do as far as either getting a response or just making it impossible for anybody to really legitimately answer the question. But I always try to remember that there are people out there who are definitely passionate creatives, and the science aspects and the measurement of it, it's not that they don't recognize the value of it. They get it. It's just not their thing.
Right, yeah.
And they're really excited about making mead. Somebody turned them onto it. They think it's going to be something that they can add to their repertoire if they already ferment something else, or maybe it's the first time they're doing it, and they don't. I do think sometimes some of the community doesn't necessarily react to that as well as maybe we could.
Yeah, you're right. There are people who get a little bit too derisive about the whole thing, but I try to gently make them understand that creativity or no creativity, if you make an awesome mead, if you haven't taken notes, you can never duplicate it again. And while mead is an art form, it would be just awful if a truly stellar mead was only ever made once. Because unlike art, once it's gone, it's gone. You can make a painting and you can hang it on the wall and look at it for, ever, however long it takes before it, falls apart or whatever. But, you can't do that. You don't see 400-year-old bottles of mead in the Smithsonian.
Well, that, and even if you did, they wouldn't be the same as when they were first bottled. That's the other thing is, age does have its effect, and sometimes for the better.
You can't enjoy it without destroying it.
Exactly. It's a very ephemeral art. So you want to if you want to be able to recreate your art, take good notes.
Because once you've popped that cork, there's no going back.
Exactly.
Yeah, my only best in show mead winner is a 1-gallon batch that I didn't take enough notes on.
And now you can't duplicate it. Yeah, I know. Don't you hate that?
But it was a chili mead that had a tincture made from fresh chilies that I had grown in the garden. There were too many variables to really believe that I was going to be able to recreate it. I've created additional versions of it in the subsequent years, which have been enjoyable to me in a way that made me feel like they were similar. They've never gone on to that same acclaim, but that's such is life, right? What I mean?
Well, if nothing else, it teaches you. You learn from that, because you can look back on that now and go, oh, if only I'd taken notes, so that any future batches that you make, you're taking notes.
You're taking the notes.
Yeah.
The other problem is, unless you're making it every single year, human condition of memory is going to paint it as in it was the best you'd ever made. It was so much better than anything else. If you reproduce it too long afterwards, that it's not a continuum, it's never going to match up to the way you remember it being because it was so much better. And it's more the improvement that got you excited than the actual quality. And so you can reproduce it later and you go, oh, it's not that much better than last time.
Well, your palate has changed and your memory... I mean, you think about it. Your memory enhances the awesome moments. So if you had an awesome mead moment, your memory is going to go, best mead ever! And so when you make it again, no matter how good your notes are, your brain's going to go, yeah, well, okay.
Meh.
It's good.
Yeah, exactly. We have another question coming in from Twitter, this one from Matt Weed at Blue Hand. What's the shelf life of a session mead, and what are the off flavors that signal it's past its prime? That's a really good question. 2 questions, actually.
It is. I've been telling people that my hope for the session meads that we produce is that they will be regarded to have a similar shelf life as IPA. They really only taste good for a month, maybe 2. They taste okay afterwards. They're not, I don't think, they don't degrade nearly as much as hops do, but the freshness does start to subside. They do kind of get into a kind of sort of, I don't know, a middle age, if you will, where they're good, but they're not as bright and fresh as 2 weeks after it was bottled or right off the tap in the tasting room. I mean, that's the ideal right there, is that I just put the keg on, you're getting the second pull off of the tap, and it was made, 18 days ago. But...
And what alcohol level do you call your hydromels in it?
I'm thinking that they're probably going to be 5.5 to 7.5. So they don't have enough alcohol to really be super preservative on their own.
Yeah.
And
no.
Yeah, not at all. And then I think the second part of that question, as far as what are the sensory indicators about it being past its prime, it's probably best described in relative terms. If you had it on day 1 and then you had it 2 months later, you would perceive a certain dullness to the fruit. I'm thinking most people should, that it just doesn't taste quite as fresh anymore. It should still be crisp. Obviously, if it's bottled, it should retain its carbonation, but maybe that's a situation where it just doesn't taste as vibrant. If you've lost fruit flavor, now you're going to be picking stuff up behind it, and maybe you're getting back to that dry mead state that it was in before the fruit was real dominant, and you might be picking up some of that underlying thin body, not a ton of flavor on its own, maybe even if some of that bitterness, if it was too dry and you didn't back sweeten it too much. But as I said, I think the parallel there is the IPA. If you know what the freshness curve of that is, I hope to serve mine in that same fashion. I want them kind of through people's consumption line quickly. I would never tell anybody to cellar a session mead that they bought from us. I don't think that would make any sense.
So really, now you've probably tasted a lot of different session meads in your research, in the process of opening Ancient Fire. Have you seen a lot of them that are, I guess, off fresh?
Let's see how to answer this question.
Yeah. Without backing yourself into a corner, right?
Yeah, and I think
you don't have to name names. It's like
No.
Something
I've run across a few that you taste it and you just think to yourself, this had to be more vibrant and interesting when it was originally put in the bottle. And really interesting point is that you probably don't even know when it was bottled.
Yeah.
So you don't actually know how old it is, right? But you have a sense that there's just something about it. Either it's as billed, it's got some fruit in it, but the fruit's just doesn't feel like it's It's got that freshness to it. Maybe it's got a dullness in the background. I actually don't see it all that often, but I'm not running into much in the way of session mead in the area I live in, which you can probably think, oh, interesting business opportunity.